Good evening, everyone. Um, Welcome back to another installment of the Volant Austrian. Uh, Today, I have a rather controversial topic for you today. It concerns uh, my political philosophy, but hopefully, I'm going to be drawing on concepts that I have discussed in my previous presentations in order to help you more uh, fully flesh out what I'm trying to share with you. Uh, and again, the title is going to be very inflammatory, but that is Anarchy is not chaos. When people use the word anarchy, they're usually referring to a general state of um, some sort of violent or riotous disorder, uh, where anarchy is used to refer to a lack of rules. But anarchy, actually, in the Greek word sense, the an meaning no, and the archy actually meaning referring to the word archon, which means not rules, but rulers. And what I want to talk to you today about is the relationship between anarchy and capitalism, namely that they are identical. Now, I have gone over in previous presentations that capitalism, or self-ownership, is the only logically viable solution to property. That is, property meaning the allocation of resources that are scarce. We went over capitalism, the three main possibilities being capitalism, hegemony, and communism. We discounted communism as being possible because in order to get absolutely everyone's permission before you could use any single resource, it would be simply impossible. Everyone would either starve to death or asphyxiate before they could breathe, because all of the resources being unavailable until everyone's permission could be attained is simply impossible. And then we went over the second solution, which would be hegemony, where a group of people or one person owns everyone else and all the resources and has ultimate control and say over what is done with those resources. And we didn't. Hegemony is not an impossible. It is not impossible like communism is impossible, but we did because we see hegemony everywhere. Most relationships today are in some way tainted by hegemony, but we went over how it was arbitrary because there's no criterion that exists that is objective, but that two people can use their reason to agree on, in order to make any one person the ruler, and so that everyone else will be the ruled. There's no criterion that's so unassailable, so logically sound that it could possibly make any one person higher or more powerful than anyone else. And so we were left with capitalism, that is, that each individual owns himself. But if each individual owns himself, we will see today that there are some very strong, very, I think, shocking consequences to that sort of idea. And, of course, I have made the contention today, as well as I have in the past, that capitalism is logically identical to anarchy. And I will now demonstrate why that is the case. This argument is a paraphrase from chapter 23 of the late Murray Rothbard's The Ethics of Liberty. This is pretty much the founding document for not the founding document, but one of the most outstanding uh, expositions of a libertarian political philosophy. Uh, this argument is taken from there, and I have done my best to put it in words that can be understood without the previous 22 chapters of the book. Hopefully that will make sense to someone who hasn't read it like I have. I've read it multiple times over now because I find it fascinating. But not only did Murray Rothbard contribute in a way, in a indisputably important way to the thought of libertarianism, but also his protege Hans Hermann Hoppe has also, in some ways, has acted to carry his torch, even since his passing in 1995. So let us begin as we get into the meatier portion of this presentation. Let's begin with a group of people who are, we would call them free. These people have no consensual relationships they have no aggressive relationships with one another. They aren't trying to hurt each other, to take each other's stuff, but they also don't have any consensual relationships either. They do not have any outstanding debts, obligations, anything of that sort. It's pretty easy, actually. You might think, how is it possible for two people to be completely free of each other in that sense? But it's pretty easy to gather 10 or so people, as I have on this slide, 10 or so people who have simply never met. Those people on the other side of the world even have absolutely no relationship to one another. If we grab them all and put them in on a small island together or something like that, we would say that these people are absolutely free of each other. We would say if they have no consent, if they have not actually gone to each other and agreed to any agreements, agreed to share property, to share labor in any way, we would say that they have no loyalties to one another, except to respect each other in persons and property. Because we all recognize, we take it as indisputable fact that if you agree to something, you are obligated, morally obligated to carry out that obligation. But we also we don't see this as often, but we also agree to the opposite, that if you don't agree to something, you are not morally obligated to carry out that obligation. So if these people haven't agreed to share their property or their labor, their persons, with each other in any way, then we would say that they don't have any loyalties, no obligations. That's pretty simple thing. Now, suppose that these people are conquered by an invading force. That these people have, for example, if we went on with the island example, these people are now, say some savages came by, or I shouldn't say savages, but natives. Some natives came by, and they decided that they were going to threaten them in some way, that they were going to enslave them, and they're separated into two different groups. And then again, for the sake of argument, let's say that they, when they're separated into two different groups, they're separated. They follow. They have taxes that they have to pay, or taxes, tributes, whatever the local word for that is. Taxes. They have laws, rules they have to follow that extend beyond the basic protections of persons and property that they were already expected to follow. They have regulations on their behavior, for maybe some customs that had been put into law by the people that live there, and now they were expected to follow those customs by some threat of force. And so there are laws and taxes and regulations that they are now expected to pay But as we said, these people did not, since they were captured, since they were aggressed against, we can say pretty easily, that there is no consent to that situation. That these people were attacked, therefore they have no, they didn't agree to be where they are, and so we would, in order to submit that the situation they are in is that they are justly subjected to those laws, we would have to submit that they are justly the slaves of the natives who had captured and enslaved them. And of course, we all find the institution of slavery to be, we rightfully find it to be repugnant to individual liberty. So, if in the course of time these people are assimilated into the culture, and they begin to take it for granted, they may or may not, depending on their attitudes, how self-reliant they are, they may or may not expect to ever break free of this captivity. But because there was no consent to the original situation, we could not possibly, because their subjugation is aggressive and therefore not consensual, we have to conclude that if some of these people were to break away, were to actually escape from the authority of the natives, and were to set up their own civilization, or their own small town somewhere, they were to voluntarily, and then enter into voluntary agreements there, and voluntary laws, voluntary, I guess we wouldn't call them taxes if they were voluntary, but more like a membership due, or something of that nature. We couldn't possibly submit that these people would be wrong in doing that, because if the original subjugation was aggressive and therefore not consensual, we must conclude that it would be right and just for some or all of those people, in fact, every single one of those people has the right to do this, some or all of those people to break away from that original aggression, which is to secede. And we call it secession. To form their own set of rights, rules, obligations, etc., into which all participants would enter voluntarily. If this new group, this third group, if any of the participants didn't enter voluntarily for some reason, then we would, of course, support their right to secede from that group again, and form a fourth group, if necessary. But if the rules they are living under, they do not live under of their own consent, then we must support their right to secede. To do otherwise, as I said, is essentially to submit that the group of people owns the person who is attempting but not able to secede, which is not, if we look back at our property norms, that's not capitalism, because capitalism, under capitalism, everyone owns himself. But what we're suggesting here is a form of hegemony, where the people within the group own the person who is attempting to secede, and therefore may prevent him from seceding. So if we truly believe that each person owns himself, we therefore believe that that person has the right to secede, to simply walk away from a situation to which he has not consented to be a part of. If we do not permit them this right, then the conclusion is that they are the rightful slaves of their conquerors, and they do not own themselves. That's a contradiction with our original assumption of capitalist property rights. Now, without consent, there can be no loyalty. We talked about that earlier. But without loyalty, there can be no such thing as treason. Now, treason is often referred to when you commit a crime against a nation which you live under. For example, Edward Snowden, in recent memory, was called a traitor because he submitted to the public eye documents which his rulers did not want him to submit. Now, arguably, Snowden at that point was a part of the ruling class as well, working for the government, but he was called a traitor because he had gone against his nation. And if we submit that a situation to which you do not consent does not give you any loyalty, then the whole idea of treason breaks down, because treason implies a loyalty to begin with that was broken. Treason implies that there is an obligation which you, in your betrayal of your country, you failed to fulfill. It's possible to betray someone with whom you have made an agreement. It's possible to breach that contract, as it's known in the legal parlance. But if there's no consent, then there's no contract in the first place. And if there's no contract in the first place, then how can we breach one? And that's why it's simply illogical to imagine that such a thing as treason really has any moral significance. Now, No Treason is the title of pamphlets by Lysander Spooner. Now, Lysander Spooner was a very interesting character. He lived during and after the Civil War, and he was the first and last person to set up a private post office in the United States. That is, with his own mailboxes, and there's a certain set of criteria that a post office fulfills that's different than, for example, UPS or FedEx. But he was the first and last person to attempt to do this in the history of the United States. And the government at the time attempted, they used the legislature to enforce monopoly powers, the monopoly powers of the United States Post Office, in order to over-legislate him and drive him out of business. It's a tragic story, and it ended up costing him a lot of money, but it drove him in his ideological. He was also a writer, and of course, someone who's in the business of sending letters is probably going to be in the business of writing them as well. And he was a writer. He created so much writing for. He has these pamphlets, the No Treason pamphlets. He wrote on the unconstitutionality of slavery. He wrote many different publications that I suppose he self-published because no one else would help him with it. But these pamphlets that I want to talk about specifically, No Treason, they concern, number one, the Constitution, and number two, the principles on which the war against secession was fought. Now, you'll probably know the war against secession as the U.S. Civil War, but I would submit that the U.S. has never fought a civil war, because in a civil war, like is going on around the world today, civil wars are still happening. In a civil war, you have a country that's divided into two or more groups, and each of the groups is fighting to control the other. So that at one point, when the civil war is concluded, one group will come out on top, and they will probably install their own government, and that's how civil wars happen. But what the U.S. fought was not a civil war. because while the North was trying to control the South, which they called maintaining the Union, uh, the South did not want to control the North. The South had no desire to. The Southern states had no desire to rule over the Northern states. They wanted to exist on their own. Now, you might have heard that the Civil War was fought over slavery, but that is it's oversimplification at best and simply untrue at worst, because both the North and the South practiced slavery, and we're going to get into that actually. Listener Spooner mentions that in the introduction to the first pamphlet in the No Treason series, and that's what I'm going to read. But Spooner, as a bit of my introduction, Spooner realized that if the principle of the Constitution was individual consent, which is what the Founding Fathers claimed that it was, that was the intellectual tradition that they were following in, if the principle of the Constitution was individual consent, as was claimed, then the Constitution actually only bound its signers, who even by his day were for some time dead. In No Treason Part 6, he goes over, he goes over voting, he goes over paying taxes, he goes over all of the other things that people tend to think of as consenting to being ruled under the Constitution, and he shows ultimately why all of those things fail, because there is nevertheless a violence that underpins the violence of being forced to pay taxes that underpins the whole system, and there's no way to differentiate between someone who actually consents to live under the Constitution and someone who's merely buckling to the threat of being forced to pay taxes and is trying to take the easy, relatively non-violent way out. There's no way to legally differentiate those two, and so it's not actually possible, while there is that threat, to consent in a way that's differentiable from non-consent to the Constitution. But now I'm going to read the introduction to Part 1 of No Treason. The question of treason is distinct from that of slavery, and is the same that it would have been if free states instead of slave states had seceded. On the part of the North, the war was carried on not to liberate the slaves, but by a government that had always perverted and violated the Constitution to keep the slaves in bondage, and was still willing to do so if the slaveholders could be thereby induced to stay in the Union. I'm going to pause for a second and remind you of Abraham Lincoln's quote that said, "If I could maintain the Union without freeing a single slave, I would do it, and if I could maintain the Union and free all the slaves, I would do it." So Lincoln's motivation was to, as he called it, maintain the Union, but really to reclaim the South as his own territory, not to free the slaves, as oversimplifying historians would have you believe today. The war was not fought over slavery, and neither the North or the South ultimately believed that was their motivation. It was the right to, whether or not they had the right to be separated from the constitutional government that the North had set up. And I will continue reading. The principle on which the war was waged by the North was simply this: that men may rightfully be compelled to submit to and support a government that they do not want, and that resistance on their part makes them traitors and criminals. No principle that is possible to be named can be more self-evidently false than this, or more self-evidently fatal to all political freedom. Yet it triumphed in the field, to which he was referring to the Civil War, the field, and it is now assumed to be established. If it be really established, the number of slaves, instead of having been diminished by the war, has been greatly increased, for a man, thus subjected to a government that he does not want, is a slave. And there is no difference in principle, but only in degree, between political and chattel slavery. The former, no less than the latter, denies a man's ownership of himself and the products of his labor, and asserts that other men may own him and dispose of him and his property for their uses and their pleasure. Previous to the war, there were some grounds for saying that, in theory at least, if not in practice, our government was a free one, that it rested on consent. But nothing of that kind can be said now, if the principle on which the war was carried on by the North is irrevocably established. If that principle be not the principle of the Constitution, the fact should be known. If it be the principle of the Constitution itself should be at once overthrown. End quote. Now, the principal argument is this. Once we admit that the secession of a group is not rightful, we really allege that the allegiance of that group is bound to the government without their consent, and that they are merely property, slaves, rather than men. If we find this principle repugnant, however, as Spooner did, then we must consider another question. What is the proper range of secession, if we admit that secession is a legitimate thing to do? If states may secede from the Union, why not counties from states, or cities from counties, or individual people? What secession means here is not simply to relocate somewhere outside the verbally claimed but unworked territory of the United States, which are not really united, but to separate oneself on the spot, including landed property. If we admit that that's what secession means, that's what it meant for the South. They did not relocate to Mexico or to Canada. They sat where they were. They kept their land, and that was where they cut off all ties from the northern government as best they could, and that was what secession meant. And that was the same principle that the 13 colonies had waged the war against Britain. Not even a century earlier at that point. Well, actually, it was nearly a century earlier. But because they did not abandon the colonies, they didn't move west to somewhere that was unowned. They stayed on the land which they had owned, which they had worked, and therefore that they owned, and they kept it. There is no that's why the slogan "America, love it or leave it," or whatever variation of that you've heard is simply illogical, because secession doesn't mean you leave the country that you don't like anymore. That's emigration. But to secede from a country is to sit where you are, including your land, and to cut off all ties. That includes both paying taxes and the services that you receive from taxes. Both of those are to be cut off immediately. That's what secession means. If of course we admit that the Constitution is not, as Spooner claimed, resting on consent, then we admit that secession is a valid course of action for those who live under the Constitution. There isn't a logical stopping point for example, we could say that Michigan can secede from the United States, but if we were to allow, Flint to secede from Michigan, or someone to secede from Flint or Detroit or whatever you want to, well, that's not technically possible. There would be too many logistical problems. Would we really enslave a man to a government that he does not want, in the words of Spooner, for logistical problems? Do logistical problems trump the the moral right of a man to own himself. If we do claim to be capitalists, then we must we must admit that every man owns himself and therefore may secede from a government which he does not want. There isn't a logical stopping point, and if we insist that there is one, for practical reasons, if it would be impractical to permit just anyone anywhere to secede, then we echo, in my view, we echo the whining refrain of the pampered Southern slaveholders who wondered, when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, if the North would compensate them for the loss of their slaves. That is that if anything, the slaves should have been compensated by the masters for the years of slavery which they had endured. And to say that it would be impractical or that it would impose a cost on the rest of the United States to allow just any person to secede is to claim the very same thing, that it's going to cost me a lot to let you not be my slave anymore, and therefore I want compensation. It's illogical. In fact, it should be the other way around, that the people who are seceding should be compensated for the lack of respect for their consent. Whoever is not permitted to secede without relocation, as I mentioned, without relocation or any imposed cost, from a government which at best glosses over his consent, is a slave to that government, in Spooner's words. And if we follow it to its logical conclusion and submit that all people are actually permitted to secede from a government which they do not want, we return to the very same situation that we had before, where no loyalty exists without consent. In the words of Rothbard, near the end of chapter 23, the state has crumbled. It did not require bloodshed. It did not require violence. In fact, the previous state of affairs was, even though it appeared to be nonviolent, that the previous state of affairs was the aggressive one, and this is simply a return to a non-aggressive state of affairs before the government was imposed. And if these people have no consensual relationships with one another, then they have no loyalty to one another except to respect each other in persons and property. Now, self-ownership, as we have described capitalism, self-ownership implies the right of self-determination. That is, every person who owns himself is permitted to make decisions concerning his own person and his own property. And if we admit that these determinations are only justly made by the person who owns and not anyone else, then we have arrived at anarchy. That's what anarchy means, not no rules, because of course we submit that there are rules. The respect of each other in persons and property, and next week we will get into on how those rules could be enforced in an anarchist manner, which is an even meatier thing than we've gotten into tonight. But for right now, let it suffice to say that self-ownership implies self-determination. And so, if you are a consistent capitalist, if you follow this principle of self-ownership to its logical conclusion, then you are an anarchist, because you admit that the government, which currently enslaves 330-some million people, or at best, some of them may very well consent to being ruled by the Constitution, but at best that consent is being glossed over or assumed simply because they live They have not imposed the cost of relocation on themselves in order to leave a certain arbitrarily defined territorial area. If you are a capitalist, then you admit that you are an anarchist. And the converse of that is, or the obverse of that is also true. That if you are not an anarchist, if you do not follow the principles of self-ownership to their logical conclusion, then you are not a capitalist. If you believe that people own themselves but only up to a certain point, if there are certain things which people are not allowed to do that don't hurt other people's persons or property, then you are not a capitalist. You don't truly submit to all of the consequences of self-ownership. You're somewhere in the middle between capitalism and communism. You are a hegemonist. You would be better off at the very least to own up to the consequences of your own ideology and not call yourself a capitalist, because capitalism presupposes the idea that people own themselves, their persons, and their property fully, and so that simply implies anarchy. There's no way to get around it. You cannot, and this is important for the constitutionalists out there. Lysander Spooner was formerly a constitutionalist. Before the Civil War was fought, he was totally in support of the Constitution because, as he mentioned in the introduction, there was at least a pretense that the Constitution was founded on consent, that the government was a free one. But after the Civil War, he realized that no such thing could actually be said about the United States government. It was not founded on consent. You cannot consistently condemn small-time amateur theft by individuals who are aggressing against each other, and in the case of the constitutional government, support it on an industrial scale by professionals. We talk a lot about career politicians. Why have they been in office 40 years and haven't fixed everything? The answer is that's not really why they're there. They're not the helping you is either a pretense or they are helping you by hurting someone else, because that's all they can do. That's the only thing that aggression does. Aggression helps someone at the expense of someone else, as opposed to a market interaction which helps both participants. Any aggressive interaction can only help someone by hurting someone else. And so you can't see small-time theft, illegal theft, as it were. You can't see that and say, I see all the damage that it does, it should never be allowed. And then you turn around and you look at the Constitution and you see that the average American is paying 20 to 40% of their income in taxes to a government which he may or may not want, and you turn around and say, well, that's okay, that's just taxation is the price we pay to live in a civilized society. I would submit that that system, which routinely robs a man of the right to consent to being ruled, is less civilized, is less civilized and less respectful of human beings as human beings and not property than anarchy is, than absolute anarchy. And again, we're going to get into next week. We're going to get into some of the ways that anarchy could actually function as a society, in how court could work, about how police and law enforcement could work, how law actually takes place between people who are not being ruled by one another. Of course, we would have to admit that everyone would consent uh, to some law. Again, it's not all going to be one law code. That's one of the things you're going to have to dispense with if you are a capitalist, is that the agreements that people make with one another in order to respect their persons and property are not all going to look exactly the same, and so there's not going to be one central authority which makes all the decisions, as there is currently under the state. But again, you can't defend the government and simultaneously condemn amateur theft. So, as I said, there's a pretense that's involved in making you think that politicians and other representatives of the government are actually here to help you. They are here to restore order rather than to subtly subvert it. That they are here to defend property rather than to aggress against it by ideological subtlety. They have to lie to get away with it, which is why I'm here. The development of the ideological foundation that has made the state possible has not been set in stone forever, as you might think. It has developed extremely slowly over hundreds of years of opportunistic manipulation. And I use the word opportunistic because, again, I'm going to draw on the previous concept that I talked about, an unconspiracy, if you remember that term. An unconspiracy to where each individual person sees that if they could spread just a little bit more of that lie, they could make just a little bit more expropriated tax money. That ideological foundation has grown straight out of feudalism, which was indisputably, from today's perspective, indisputably the expropriation by kings and vassals of the peasants, simply, again, because they lived on the land that the kings and the vassals claimed. That ideological foundation, that land, living on a certain landmass, makes a certain small set of people entitled to your tax money, that comes straight out of feudalism. Now, it's that feudalism is what encouraged the so-called divine right of kings, where the king, there were perversions of the Bible whereby the king was actually seen as having the right to extort the tax money from the peasants because God had imbued him with that right, with that divine right. And of course we see that as hogwash. But nowadays the interpretation is not so different. The interpretation is in general that the existing authorities, the ruling governing authorities, are justified in levying taxes simply because they exist, because God has allowed them to exist. They are the governing authorities, and therefore you have to submit to them and you have to pay taxes. And I'm not the kind of person who would rise up with arms to revolt against the establishment, as it were, because I believe that God has called Christians to peace at all costs, to live at peace with all men. But I would also submit that the situation that currently exists is not a peaceful one, because even though I do not harbor any aggressive intent against the government does harbor aggressive intent against me, because if I don't pay my taxes, they're going to prosecute me, and then they're going to put me in jail, or if I resist that, as I would be right in doing, because they are trying to expropriate my property, and then they're trying to expropriate my body and put me in a cell. And then, if I resist doing that, they will claim self-defense and they will shoot me dead. And then they will have murdered me. And that right there is enough demonstration to see that the system of taxation which exists is fundamentally aggressive. Because whether or not I consent, they have no idea, and frankly, they don't care. And if I don't follow along, they will prosecute me, cage me, or shoot me dead. That's just the way it is. You can't squirm around that. That's how they treat tax evaders. They call them evaders as if it was their actual duty to pay taxes, and if they didn't pay taxes, they were committing, again, some act of treason, which doesn't exist. It's a made up category of crimes to talk about the breach of a contract that only ever existed in the mind of one party. In the mind of governing officials, that contract only ever existed there. It did not exist. It certainly doesn't exist in my mind, but they still expect me to pay taxes. I do not consent to pay taxes, but they still expect me to do it. So it has to be aggressive. There's either a consensual agreement or it's aggression. That's just those are the options. There's nothing in between. Now, again, I'm not the kind of person who would rise up with arms against that effort, because I believe that Christians are called to peace at all costs. But that relationship is not peaceful. It cannot be peaceful. Now, to my very best effort, I have shown you what I believe to be the truth. I have laid out my feelings on, or my educated opinions on the topic, and I also want you to note that my name, my face, and probably many other compromising pieces of information are associated with this stream. So, if and when some future, even more authoritarian government comes to evaluate the thoughts of each of its citizens, this stream will be erased, and as a consequence, as a thought criminal, if I'm still alive at that point, I will be imprisoned, probably tortured and killed, because of what I believe, and many others will be as well, but I will be among them. I am putting everything on the line to share this with you, and I do that without fear, because I know that the Bible says not to fear those who kill the body. But I am sure enough of my position that I will publicly oppose any and all Caesars who find this to be an inconvenient truth that has to be erased. I am not the sort of man who would rise up with arms to seek a justice that looks more like a self-interested vengeance against the government. But I would prefer peace at all costs. But what I know is that my relationship with Caesar is not one that is peaceful, but of silent war. I would not fight him, but he would enslave me, and therefore while he adopts that attitude of aggression, he is no peacemaker, which the Beatitudes bless. The Beatitudes say, "Blessed are the peacemakers," but he is not making peace with me or anyone else whom he claims to rule. So that distinction simply doesn't apply to him. Again, that's probably something you've heard that should apply to governing officials, but it can't, as we've seen. This is no peace under which we live. Any consistent Christian seeks peace, and therefore any consistent Christian seeks to abolish that institution which has its very essence in usurping peace and replacing it with a mere lack of bloodshed. That's all that we have, is a simple lack of bloodshed. Peace is voluntary cooperation between individuals. A lack of bloodshed can appear even under a continual state of aggressive war between individuals. And that's what we live under today. Now, after all of that, do we have any questions? I did hear that we had a comment, but do we have any questions? I am going to ask you to have patience on that question. I do have an answer to that. 30 million different rules and directions is unlikely. In fact, it's impossible. You're correct. 30 million different rules and directions. If everyone did what was right in their own eyes, as the Bible describes it, it would truly be chaos. But it would not be anarchy, because anarchy implies a respect of persons and property, which cannot occur under 30 million different directions, because certainly some of those people will be criminals. Certainly some of those people will seek to aggress against persons and property, the persons and property of other individuals. And so 30 million is not possible if in a population of 30 million people. But what's known as in the literature as polycentric law, where there are more than one sets of rules within a certain jurisdiction, is possible. And in fact, take for example the states that we live under now. The citizens of Michigan and Ohio get along just fine. They do not live under a state of chaos with each other, even though in a certain sense they do live under anarchy, because Michigan and Ohio, what happens is that someone who has a Michigander who has a grief with an Ohioan takes his grievance to a court in Michigan, and then the court in Michigan sends the verdict down to Ohio, where another court will either choose to accept or reject the verdict on that grievance. And if it rejects that grievance, then the two courts will take it to a federal court, an appeals court, which resolves the dispute for all three courts. And that sort of thing would be very common under anarchy as well. That's what I'm going to get into, is how the court system and law enforcement could still function under anarchy. But there would be more than one. And there are more than one system today. But there would certainly be far more than there are now under statism, as it's called. Any other comments? Okay. No more. I don't see any more comments. So today has been a heavy one. So be sure to think about what I've said throughout the week, because we're going to come back to it. There's going to be a part 2 to this next week. See you Saturday at 8 p.m. And this has been the Voluntaustrian signing off. Have a great week.